All right. So we're very lucky today to have Professor Carlos Sanchez here visiting our campus and willing to give this talk on Mexicano for Fortuna. Carlos has published 5 books.
It's gonna be 10 soon. Yeah, 10. Yeah.
So many books, an amazing publication record, lots of books and lots of articles as well on topics related to Mexican philosophy and other things. So thank you so much for coming. Let me just add one more thing. I always forget this. In the Q&A, which we'll do about maybe 45 minutes for the talk and 45 minutes for Q&A, we will start with student questions. So if a student wants to ask a question, we'll start with you, but if anybody can raise their hand at any time. Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And you know, it's a pleasure to be here. I feel very fortunate to be here. So thank you. I want to start by playing a song. I discovered this summer that people can do that. See, I didn't know that people could start a talk by playing music. But I'm going to do that. And if you don't know Spanish, that's okay. But I'm going to play this song and the first maybe minute of it as soon as the ad finishes. So you know, I apologize for it not being too loud, but here we go. You guys know the song? Do you know the song? Do you know? Yeah.
Es mi orgullo haber nacido en el barrio más humilde, alejado del bullicio y de la falsa sociedad. Yo no tengo la desgracia de no ser hijo del pueblo. Yo me cuento entre la gente que no tiene falsedad.
So this is where I started here.
Yo lo quiero publicar, soportando una tristeza por detrás de una ilusión. Yo camino por la vida muy feliz con mi pobreza, porque no tengo dinero. Corazón. Descendiente de Cuauhtémoc, mexicano por fortuna. Desdichado en los amores, soy borracho y trovador.
And then it goes on, right? And at this point, if you are familiar with the song, you're also familiar with what happens when people are listening to it, right? Which is drinking, being really sad, being really happy. It's a very famous song in the Mexican culture specifically. So, in one of Vicente Fernandez's most enduring and emblematic ballads, El Hijo del Pueblo, which we just heard, the legendary Mexican crooner, I say legendary for one reason and one reason only. I mean, if you know him, you know that he's legendary, but also Beyonce, when he died, when Vicente Fernandez died, Beyonce paid him tribute. And I thought, whoa, he must be really legendary then. The legendary Mexican crooner celebrates his Mexicanness by proclaiming a deeply held cultural belief. He sings that he, like all Mexicans, is a descendant of Cuauhtémoc and Mexican by fortune, Mexicano por fortunas. This is a very sad song, and this line, one of his most beloved, is saturated with history and trauma. Over the years, it has become an anthem to Mexicans wherever in the world they find themselves. As it comes on the car radio, at a party, over the supermarket speakers, at a bar, witness men, women, and children sing its somber verses as if it were a most intimate prayer. People drink to it, cry to it, and commune with one another as they lean into the phrase, Mexicano por fortuna. In this line, the protagonist reaffirms an indigenous descendancy to the last Aztec emperor, who, on being captured, tortured, and kidnapped by the Spanish, was later hanged by Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador responsible for the brutal destruction of Mexico Tenochtitlan in 1521. The murder of Cuauhtémoc at the hands of Cortés signals the fall of the Aztec Empire and the rise of colonial rule. Cortés' brutal treatment of Cuauhtémoc prefigures the subjugation and dehumanization of the rest of the indigenous population at the hands of the conquerors, especially of indigenous women who were sexually exploited, raped, or killed in alarming numbers. The brutality of these events, particularly the sexual exploitation of indigenous women, would bring about the modern Mexican. In the song Mexican by Fortune, in this song, Mexican by Fortune has a double significance. On the one hand, it means that Mexicans are a product of luck and may not have appeared in history had things been different. If only Cuauhtémoc had put up more of a resistance, his 100,000-man army would have easily defeated Cortés and his rugged band of hundreds. If this had been so, then the sexual violence that produced a Mexican would not have occurred, or so we think. In this sense, being Mexican by fortune is just being a product of the worst sort of luck. But it also means, on the other hand, that despite the violence that produced them, Mexicans are a product of good fortune. In this reappropriation of the Mexican origin story, Mexicans express pride in having survived and persevered in spite of their origins and in spite of how they've been treated. They reappropriate this act of luck and the suffering and the subjugation attached to it for the sake of pride and unity. Fortune, then, doesn't point to Cuauhtémoc's miscalculation of the violence that followed or to the worst sort of luck, but to a profound sense of belonging. And so when I listen to El Hijo del Pueblo, the phrase Mexicano por fortuna immediately transports me into a sense of community, where we are accidental together, where we are fortunate to be Mexican, and to have survived centuries of violence, suffering, and oppression, without which we wouldn't be here today. Being accidental is who we are. Now, the idea expressed by Vicente Fernandez here is the idea of fortune, or the idea of fortune points to a more robust philosophical notion, that of contingency. It says that everything that appears stable, certain, or necessary didn't have to be so, and will surely cease to be so at some point, that all things, all concrete things, will reveal their instability, uncertainty, and finitude. Their destruction is inevitable. Everything is slipping away. European existentialists couched this idea in the notion of becoming, a result of the priority of existence over essence. John Dewey himself called it contingency. Mexican philosophers call it accidentality. The Aztecs referred to this notion with a metaphor, reminding each other that, quote, the earth is slippery. In what follows, my focus will be on the last two, but particularly on Mexican philosophy, where accidentality serves as a core existential concept. I'll begin by discussing accidentality in the context of Mexistentialism, which means telling you first what Mexistentialism is and what it isn't. Second, I'm going to tell you what Emilio Uranga says about accidentality. The third, I think I have it. Yeah, there it is. The third section represents a decolonial term. At this point, you may have been, at this point in my talk, you will have been making some connections between Emilio Uranga and the existentialist tradition that begins with Kierkegaard and moves through Heidegger to Sartre, Camus, and so on. Accidentality may even remind you of Simone de Beauvoir's notion of ambiguity. And you may not be wrong. Uranga may actually agree with you. There's definitely some of that in his account, but the decolonial turn I'm going to make traces his notion of accidentality to Nahuatl thought, to Aztec wisdom sayings. I will conclude by saying some things about how to accidentalize yourself and why this is a good thing. Okay, so what is Mexistentialism? Accidentality is a core concept in Mexican existentialism or Mexistentialism. Now, let me tell you real quick about this Mexistentialism business, right? I had been calling it Mexican existentialism for a while, and then one day it just clicked that maybe I could put them together and it would be Mexistentialism. And then I was talking to Manuel Vargas, who's at UC San Diego, and he says, well, a student of mine called it that like 2 years ago. And I said, yeah, but I didn't hear the student of yours, right? So I started having like thoughts about, I have to copyright this, right? before somebody else does. So I published a paper, and then I just published a book recently, came out about 2 weeks ago, where an entire chapter is existentialism. So I think that's copyright enough, right? It should be mine now. So existentialism is existentialism with a Mexican flair. Like European existentialism, it takes seriously the concreteness of activity of situated human existence. Unlike European existentialism locates the human struggle in a geographically determined space and historically determined time, both of which affect our being human in a definite way. Existentialism cares about the specificity of where and when one happens to find oneself. Existentialism's where is Mexico, while this post-colonial and particularly post-revolution, or is Mexico specifically, it's post-colonial and particularly post-revolutionary Mexico. After all, writes Leopoldo Zea, who was one of these early philosophers of this tradition, if we are to be faithful to philosophy, we have to affirm that our situation is not that of Jean-Paul Sartre. Our situation is not that of the European bourgeoisie. Luis Villoro, one of the founders of this movement, of the existentialist movement, traces the introduction of existentialism to the Mexican philosopher Antonio Caso, who offers a course on Soren Kierkegaard and the Russian existentialist Nikolai Bardyaev in the fall of 1939. However, the arrival of existentialism as a philosophical tradition is credited to José Gauss, through whom the name of Heidegger is announced for the first time in Mexico toward the late 1930s. According to Villoro, quote, in the span of 5 years, between 1942 and 47, Gauss offers courses on being and time, courses that until today give a systematic exposition of his philosophy. Villoro continues, quote, few academic courses had left to that point such a profound imprint in Mexico than those given during the Heideggerian years. Ever since then, there is a surge in interest for existential philosophy, unquote. The question is why such an intense interest in existentialism at this time? Existentialism resonated with Mexican thinkers in a way that other traditions had not. It was not because it was simple to understand and articulate, because it really is not, but because it spoke to them, to their needs, to their situation. So this is a quote up here. Luis Villoro says, definitely what decides the value of existentialism is its capacity to lend ground to a systematic description of human existence, but not of human existence in the abstract, but of a situated human existence in a situation, of a human existence located in a determinate geographical habitat, in a social and cultural space also determined and with a precise historical legacy. Existentialism, that is, allows Mexican philosophers to focus on their own specific situation or circumstance, not on some abstract version of the abstract human circumstance, which may marginalize or exclude. Existentialism, moreover, tells Mexicans that their present is in a state of flux, of constant becoming. Now, this is good news, since a space in flux or becoming is one where the historical legacy need not have authority, where history could have been otherwise and could still be. Existentialism allows Mexican philosophers to rethink that legacy and its impact on the present and how to determine that legacy needs to be. So there's like this political aspect to existentialism, right? The idea is that Mexicans felt at the time that they had to think a certain way. And they have to think a certain way because this is the way that people have been thinking for 500 years or 450 years. So we have to think this way. And this is the way that we're going to continue thinking. And so what existentialism allows them to do, or the way they understood it, is that is telling us that everything is change and everything is revocable. And therefore, we don't have to think the way we've been thinking. We can think in many other different ways because things change, right? So this notion of change was a very welcomed philosophical concept. Existentialism, Mexistentialism in a nutshell then will carry out an existential investigation of Mexican existence with concepts derived from its own legacy, but applicable to any situated human existence. To do this, it appropriates and traffics in the standard notions of European existentialism, so it doesn't leave that too far behind. We are familiar, of course, with a conceptual horizon of European existentialism, one where we find notions of freedom, throwness, anxiety, responsibility, death, subjectivity, faith, absurdity, and boredom. To these, Mexistentialism adds the following concepts: zozobra, Nepantla, relajo, and what I'm going to be talking about, accidentality. All right, so what is accidentality? Now, I began by making a connection between fortune and accident, or better still, between being a result of fortune and being accidental, both of which are variations of luck, of chance, contingency, and uncertainty. In his book that I also published, translated this book a couple of years ago, is Analysis of Mexican Being, Análisis del Ser del Mexicano. Emilio Uranga centers accidentality as constitutive of what it means to be Mexican and makes the following assertion about his own philosophical project. He says, the being of the human being as accidental is the most important affirmation that we make. Now, accidentality defines how Mexicans as concrete and temporal beings exist. Uranga says that the concrete is the accidental and that the accidental is the concrete. So if it is concrete and temporal, then it's accidental. This seemingly implies that accidental is who we all are, not just Mexicans, but all concrete, finite beings who see themselves in one way or another as products of fortune or luck. Accidentality, of course, has a long philosophical history if you're taking anything with ancient philosophy. Aristotle places it in opposition to substance. Substance is primary, self-sufficient, the accident, secondary, and dependent. Uranga thinks of accidentality in the same way. First as dependence, as a contingency of being, and so on. With Aristotle, he thinks of accidentality as secondary to substance. To be an accident is to be accidental, or an accident of substance, which again is, which its substance is going to be self-sufficient and necessary. So an accident is not necessary. Uranga then applies this understanding to persons, and particularly persons who he says, and this is how he defines his audience, those that by 1,000 accidents of history have been framed by the catastrophic. Now, who are those people, right? Who is it that has been framed by the catastrophic? For him, it's going to be Mexicans and a long history of violence, colonization, marginalization. I like to think that for us, these days, after 9/11, after COVID, after World War II, after the Cold War, or whatever, like we're all framed by the catastrophic, right? So it's I think that's why that's how I justify thinking that Mexican philosophy belongs to us all, right? Because it's and everybody should know about it because now we're all framed by the catastrophic. So those framed by the catastrophic are those who have been shaped by a history of trauma and violence and misfortune. They are also the ones considered unnecessary, dependent, and accidental. Given their history, Mexican people fit the bill. But Uranga also wants it to define others, or the being of non-Mexican persons in a more general sense, and to include those that are framed by the catastrophic, who, if we want to be fair, can include all concrete human life today. We can think of accidentality then as describing life itself as always in flux and constant becoming. And we can think of it as describing individual life itself. You are not substantial, I'm not substantial. Right? Our self-sufficiency has its limits. Ultimately, we're all dependent on something greater than ourselves, whether that's God, the state, urban planning, public policy. This dependence exposes our fragility or our accidentality, that we exist as a result of chance or fortune, a chance encounter between sperm and egg, something that didn't have to happen. Accidentality extends to other areas of life as well. What you own, your car, your house, or espresso machine, or whatever, are accidental in the sense that they can be taken away at any moment. You can lose your job, you fall ill, you're accused of a crime, and what you own simply disappears. Everything you have is always one decision, one choice, one moment away from not being yours. Time, space, and freedom terrorize you because you must do something with them in order to keep on living. As Uranga uses the term, accidentality is what and how you are. Mexicans, for instance, are the result of a violent encounter between the Spanish and the indigenous peoples that didn't have to happen. And that there is a possible world in which Cortés and his men were slaughtered by the Aztecs. And what we know as a modern Mexican was never created out of the two. Now, Uranga also thinks of accidentality in a second sense. And he contrasts that with self-sufficiency. Now, self-sufficiency for him is radical independence. And he uses the word substance, and then he uses self-sufficiency. So that's something else. As insufficient, one exists always in relationship of dependence to what is radically sufficient. Those who are insufficient will find themselves dependent on the generosity of the rich, the state, the powerful, and so on, to those who claim to be self-sufficient. This makes it so that insufficient life is always seen as disposable and interchangeable, and he even says that they're subject to extermination. Well, Uranga has in mind the historical relation of Mexicans to the Spanish elite, one in which Mexicans were always insufficient due to their hybridity or impurity. Today, we can talk about the impurity is mestizaje, right? Today, we can talk about, for instance, the perception of immigrants and refugees as insufficiently American, insufficiently civilized, insufficiently educated, compared to true Americans. Jorge Portilla has this wonderful essay that's in one of another book that I published. I translated this essay. It's called The Spiritual Crisis of the United States, where Portilla is analyzing the U.S. culture as suffering from what he calls a false sense of innocence, right? Like everything seems to shock Americans, and it's like a sign of bad faith because they pretend to be shocked because they want to keep that purity, that sense of innocence, a sense of uniqueness, right? And innocence is just that ideology. And he has this wonderful story about how this in the 1950s, the guy who was running the Hollywood Cemetery down there in Hollywood put a contest together to find the best. He wanted to put a statue of Jesus Christ in the middle of a cemetery. And he wanted to be a representation of an American Christ, right? So he opened it up internationally to everybody who wanted to contribute a statue or a sample of a statue that then would go into the cemetery, and he rejected them all because none of the statues of Jesus were smiling, right? And Portilla's like, why do you want a smiling Jesus? I mean, Jesus suffered, right? And that was just a representation of that innocence, right? That idea that no, we're pure, we're good here. So, anyways, as insufficient immigrants and refugees are treated as inessential to the social good and thus accidental to it. Now, the truth is that we're all insufficient, even the rich and the powerful, Americans and so on, and particularly in the sense that we are dependent on many other things, like gravity or social structures or powers that are greater than our individual selves. We're all insufficient, inessential, and accidental to life, to the planet, to the universe. Okay. So this is my third part. I call this the decolonial turn. Now I'm using the term I will use the term decolonization to refer to a process of destabilizing the particularly Western conception of all philosophical concepts. Now, I don't want to say that it's a process of severing because I don't think that's possible. Specifically, in Decolonizing Accidentality, I aim to read it through a non-Western lens, and so return it to some original context of meaning. I'm thus being very loose with the term, and you may even think not very technical. I got into an argument with one of my colleagues who writes on decolonial philosophy, because he was like, well, that's not how we use it. Well, that's how I'm using it, right? Because I don't think that decolonialization is a viable project, and second of all, this is as far as we can go. So that's all I'm doing. I'm being very loose with it, and some might say not very technical. This is because all I mean to do here is to think about Mexican philosophy, even for a split second, without its European scaffolding, to unhinge Mexican existentialism from Heidegger and Sartre and Camus and de Beauvoir. If I were serious about decolonizing this tradition that I'm talking about here, I wouldn't call it existentialism. But this is not my project here. I want to call it existentialism and say that we can ground it on something besides European traditions. We can ground it on pre-conquest Mexica, Nahuatl, or Aztec philosophy. Okay, so what do I mean? Now, Uranga's intuition is that Mexican being, what the Mexican is ontologically, is accidental, always on the brink of falling into oblivion. This is not something that he realized after the advent of the tradition known as existentialism. This is something that Mexicans have always known. Moreover, it is something that's part of the culture. It is part of the other half of the Mexican person, which is indigenous, that is framed by the catastrophic, as Uranga puts it. The indigenous people didn't believe in necessity in their theologies, in substantial identity. The world, like their like their deities in themselves, were always perilously close to non-being. In the years after the fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521, the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún took on the monumental task of interviewing survivors of the genocidal Spanish conquest and asking them for their wisdom. And I have the Nahuatl word here, but I can't pronounce it. But it basically means the words of the elders or ancient talks. Right? This is what they were called. The word in Nahuatl is Huehue Tlatoli. Because everything else had been destroyed, all the religious, scholarly sources had been burned or repurposed. This is as close as we will come to get to their philosophy, to the indigenous philosophies. Well, in one of these ancient talks, a noble mother advises her daughter on the proper way to live. She says, "Behold the road that you must follow. On earth, it is a time for care. It is a place of caution. We travel, we live along mountain peaks. Over here, there is an abyss. Over there, there's an abyss. If you goes here and if you goes there, you will fall. Only in the middle must you go. Only in the middle must you live." Right? The middle is the Nepantla, right? Only in Nepantla must you live. Right? So what prompts this advice from the mother to the daughter is the idea central to Aztec thought generally that the world is a dangerous place, that nothing is certain or guaranteed, and that the only way to live is to walk in the middle, what they call Nepantla. Of course, walking in the middle, or being Nepantla, doesn't guarantee that you won't fall. You can fall at any moment for any reason, and once you fall, you may slip and slide all the way to your death. Precarity is always on the foreground of Mexica thought. It is the idea that there's only precarity and uncertainty and accident, that there's only good or bad fortune. Now, my good friend James Maffey tells us that part of the mother's instructions would have included a proverb. And the proverb says, "It is slippery. It is slick on the earth." Or, "Things slip, things slide in this world." Now, the idea is that nothing is secure and all is uncertain. The surface of the earth is treacherous, narrow, harpoon-like, sharp, jagged paths between mountain peaks with steep abysses on both sides. So the imploration from the mother to the daughter is to walk carefully, to walk with caution. Now, if you ever walked up a rocky hillside after a storm or early on the morning when the morning dew is still on the grass, you know why the Aztecs would heed this proverb. With each step, you really do expect your feet to slide on the slippery surface of the rocks or the grass. You almost anticipate it. You hold on to the muddy ground with your hands, you slip and slide, and eventually you fall, regardless of how careful you are. There is dread and anxiety that comes with this. You may reach the top of the hill, but you'll be muddy and probably bruised, dirty and wet. And even if you're careful, chances are you will slip and slide and fall nonetheless. For the Aztecs, your life path is slippery like this from the moment you begin to walk. The path is always slippery. Falling is always a possibility, and the fact that you did not fall is just accidental, a result of your good fortune or your luck. Now, James Maffey gives this proverb its philosophical spin. He says, life on earth is slippery because order and being are always sliding into disorder and non-being. The existence and well-orderedness of the things upon which human beings depend slip away from under their feet, causing them to lose their balance and suffer pain, hunger, thirst, sorrow, disease, and death. That this was a way of thinking for the Aztecs, a way of thinking that survived the conquest and the annihilation of the wise men, allows me to think that Urango was tapping into something in his own philosophical observation. This is what Uranga says. The accident is fragility, oscillation between being and nothingness. This means that its fit in being, its adhesion to being expressed in the modality of being in, is not protected by an inalienable right, but rather whatever may be the form of its adherence, it is always revocable. The accident is constantly threatened by displacement, desolajamiento. Attached to this being, it can always be torn off from its there. It can be exterminated. He uses the word exterminated, which I always found very interesting there. Whatever it holds on to, whatever handle it grabs onto, can be removed. It was born to be in and at the same to not be in. Now, the insecurity of being is manifested psychologically in the view that life seems to be constantly slipping away, in the knowledge that whatever we possess is revocable, and that the whole of reality is itself threatening and overwhelming. In an ontological sense, this lack of security points to a fragility and vulnerability that describes us all. But I like to suggest that Uranga was tapping into his own historical legacy here, even more so than he was into the popular philosophy of his time, which is existentialism. Part of a Mexican upbringing, already in a cultural zeitgeist, as part of what it means to be Mexican, it was always there. Jorge Portilla, a contemporary of Uranga, says in one of his writings that we Mexicans are existentialists by birth. Okay? And I think that he was referring to this being born with a consciousness of danger, precarity, falling, the slippery earth, accidentality. But we can certainly make the case that accidentality emerges from a tradition that begins with Heidegger. There's also plenty of reasons to suggest, for example, that he was reading Dewey's notion of contingency, maybe. Or as I'm saying here, Nahuatl philosophical ideas. The decolonial turn for me is one that's easy to make here. All right, part 4. I'm almost done, guys, don't worry. Accidentalizing yourself. Now, the observation that we are accidental is obvious when we think about it. I didn't have to be born here, yet here I am. I didn't have to be a professor, yet I am. I didn't have to study philosophy, yet I did. In some other version of my life, I'm still working in the broccoli fields outside of King City, California. Many things had to randomly happen for me to be here in Merced today. One of which I was just thinking about on the drive here, right? I was doing my undergraduate in advertising. I have an advertising degree, right? And I worked in advertising and I was working. I was doing an internship, and I absolutely hated it. So one day I quit, and I walked to the philosophy department at San Jose State, and I said, I want to get a master's. And they said, okay, fine. Have you taken any philosophy classes? And I had taken a couple, right? So I said, yeah. And so then I needed money, so they made me a grader to Rita Manning. I don't know if you know Rita Manning. Rita Manning had been there for many years, and a very feisty professor, feminist philosopher. And one day she got in a fight with a security guard at the parking lot, and she got arrested, right? Okay, so here I am sleeping in my house. I'm still in bed. And I get a phone call from the department administrator saying, okay, you got to teach this class. I had never been in front of a class in my life. I had never been in front of students. And I said, what do I teach? I don't know what to teach. What do I do? And the administrator said, teach what you know. Right. Well, what I knew was that every Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday nights, me and my friends used to get drunk and read Karl Marx. So I knew Marx. I thought I knew. Obviously, I didn't know Marx, but I knew Marx enough, right, to show up that morning and teach Marx to a bunch of business ethics students. Right? And the first 15 minutes were torture, right? Because I was so scared. I could barely talk. And then after when the 16th minute hit, I realized that that's the only thing I ever wanted to do. That's all this is it. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to do this. And here I am. So now if Rita Manning wouldn't have gotten arrested, I don't know what I'll be doing right now. That's my story. Okay, so according to Uranga, Mexicans are more aware than most that their history is filled with accidental encounters and all sorts of luck. A quick look at Mexican culture, its art, its music, and so on reveals it's saturated with uncertainty, insecurity, what-ifs. Conquest, colonization, imperialism, revolutions, and so on. These all happened, but they also seem as though they didn't have to happen. Uranga says that Mexicans exist in a, quote, proximity to the accident, which means that Mexicans recognize their accidental condition easier than other groups. Perhaps this is a generalization that he didn't have to make, but that he did just points to who he was talking to and why he was talking to them. He was talking to peoples whose historical identity had been shaped by violence or catastrophe, and whose everyday life had been defined by constant peril and danger. He's not speaking to or for people who don't see themselves constituted by catastrophe. Those folks will perhaps say to themselves that their lives are accidental, but not really mean it. It is likely to be a mental exercise where accidentality is just an intellectual idea, referring to a possible world in which they didn't have to exist. These people will not make accidentality a central theme of their everyday thinking because what they really think is that their lives are somehow necessary or destined. As Uranga said, that their lives are substantial. But Mexicans who are reminded of their accidentality by their history, by their music, by their poetry, by their circumstance, will live as though they are, in fact, accidental, and consider necessity and substantiality as fanciful notions reserved for those who have nothing to worry about, those who have nothing to risk, those who have the privilege to mythologize themselves in such ways. Now, in Uranga's existential project, the task is to get us to accept our accidental condition as more than an idea, as a reality, not just an intellectual idea most of us have had at some point in our lives, telling us that who we are today is just a random result of choices we've made in the past, but as a fact. The point that Uranga hammers home is that more than recognizing this fact, we must accept it and make it part of the way we see our lives and the world around us. In fact, Uranga tells us that firmly grasping life's accidentality is a healthy way to live. He says that we must become accidental. This means shedding all illusion to necessity, perfection, and the self-sufficiency that belongs to things not affected by chance or circumstance. Uranga calls this the project of accidentalizing yourself. It requires you to keep your accidentality always on the foreground of your thinking, and doing so that you may become more aligned with the reality of your real human condition. And you must take on this project if you don't want to continue to live inauthentically in bad faith or in the foolish illusion of self-sufficiency, radical independence, or historical inevitability or necessity. The difficulty with taking on this project is that it will clash with what you ordinarily believe about yourselves. Namely, that you are on this earth for a reason. I tell myself that all the time. That everything in your life points to it being somehow destined. But we must actively work at getting rid of these illusions, because the truth is that none of us is sufficient or necessary in the way we've come to believe. We're all accidental. Now, early Mexican colonial history could be seen as a time when Spanish in particular, and Europeans in general, covered over their accidentality by asserting the superiority of both their race and their worldview. Key to their confidence was the belief that the conquest and the colonization were God ordained, and that their success with both colonization and conquest proved it. As a matter of fact, they really believed that they discovered America in 1492 because that's when Jesus told them it was okay to discover America. So they had this belief that God had made this happen. Believing that one is carrying out a divine mission is a conceit that goes hand in hand with a belief in one's goodness, perfection, necessity, and innocence. Those not sharing this mission, but rather being subjugated by it, which in America included indigenous peoples, African slaves, hybrid Mexican mestizos, were treated as inferior and disposable, even though ostensibly saving their souls was meant to be of utmost importance. It was easy then for the Spanish to think of themselves as defined not by accident or finitude, but by substance, by permanent subjectivity, while considering everyone else as accidental, to do with as they please, given the righteousness of their mission. Of course, non-Spaniards eventually internalized this perversion, reading their human accidentality as an inferiority complex. And this played into the colonizing mission. The thing is that colonialism prefers subjects with inferiority complexes, subjects who believe themselves to be unworthy or undeserving of good things or good temperament or treatment. Oppressive systems demand subjects who recognize themselves as subservient and inferior, and who believe at the same time in the superiority of their opposites. Colonialism needs its subjects to exist vulnerably, as perpetually threatened by extermination. However, those who recognize their accidentality don't have to accept the worldview that puts them at the bottom of the power structure. They don't have to accept their subjugation, knowing that their sense of inferiority is an illusion, one that hides a more human contingency, is a source of power and sets people on the path to challenging the way things are. This is all part of what it means to take up the project of accidentalization, and why it was such an important idea for Mexicans in particular at this time. So Uranga proposes that one choose accidentality so as to be true to oneself. For Mexicans, choosing themselves as accidental meant choosing, as he puts it, the negation of the Spanishness, which presents itself as substantial. For the rest of us, choosing ourselves as accidental means choosing the negation of anything that presents itself as perfect, self-sufficient, and necessary. Nothing has to be the way that it is. Ideas, cultures, politics are all up for radical rethinking and change once you realize the accidentality at their core. Now, when we embrace accidentality, we can more easily navigate a world we know to be in constant state of transformation. We may even become comfortable, or at least more at ease, with disaster, with trauma, with our own imperfections. The project of having to be accident involves not slipping into the delusion of our own necessity and our own permanence by understanding that we are products of chance and circumstance. If we take on the project of accidentalizing ourselves, we'll try to recall that our very life is a result of an accidental encounter between two people, that we didn't have to be born, and that any one of these days could be our last. In accidentalizing ourselves, we return to our accidental origins. But perhaps this is too heavy of a thought. In that case, a lighter version of this project of accidentalization will involve remembering that all we have, our possessions, our careers, and families are revocable, that they could all be taken away without a moment's notice. That's the lighter version of it. A wrong turn at an intersection, an unintentional glance at a stranger, leaving the house 10 minutes early, and so on. Any of these could result in the loss of all that we have or all that we are. The lesson is this. The project of having to be accident or accidentalizing yourself involves not forgetting the accidentality in whatever degree of sophistication we can recall it. I try to keep always in mind that the person I am today is a result of many different accidents, traumas, or happenings that I was lucky to survive or live through. However, at the same time, the project also involves keeping in mind that although I may think of myself as a result or product of those accidental encounters, and thus delude myself into thinking that the process of becoming who I am is somehow complete, because that's how we think of product or a result. The reality is that accidents can happen at any time, accidents that have the power to change me again and again and again, until death makes any more accidents impossible and makes me unchangeable. All right, my conclusion. Now, no one is surprised when the son or daughter of a famous actor becomes an actor themselves. Right? You're not surprised when Sofia Coppola becomes a director, right? Because you're like, oh, well, yeah. My guess is that they aren't surprised either. It is as if they were meant to follow in some prefabricated footsteps. Similarly, no one wonders when the son or daughter of intellectuals become an intellectual. I know of a number of philosophers whose parents were philosophers. These folks are usually very sure of their career choice and confident of what they know. They've known they wanted to be, and the ones that become philosophers known they wanted to be philosophers since they were children. It is as if they were meant to be philosophers, and their whole life is lived in order to live up to that expectation, perhaps surpass it. My parents were immigrant farm workers from Mexico. I learned to read and write English when I was 17 years old. I went to underperforming high school and a state college. My grades were not great at all. I actually spent time when I was a senior in high school, I spent time in the juvenile hall facility in Stanislaus County here in Modesto. I was locked up for a good chunk of time in that place. So I wasn't supposed to be a philosophy professor. Now I am confronted now because of all that with the question, why did I choose the humanities? Why did I choose philosophy? I'm sure that you get this question too. The insinuation here is that as a Mexican American, as a son of immigrant parents, as first-generation college student, person of color, etc., this course of study should not have been an option. My answer is usually something to the effect of, well, it just so happened that, right? And I tell the story of a bunch of accidents that took place, right? Because that's exactly what happened. I wrote this somewhere, and it's out there in the internet somewhere, but my grandfather, when I was a kid, the word filósofo was a bad word, right? It didn't describe a thinker of stature. It didn't describe somebody who was writing books. It didn't describe a professor, right? It described somebody that was lazy and didn't want to work, right? Which is kind of true, right? But I remember when I was a kid and I would go to pick up firewood with my grandpa or plant corn seed or whatever. And then I would just kind of wander off and, do this. Then he would throw things at me like, filósofo, cabrón, get over here, right? Pinche filósofo. So I always heard the word filósofo preceded by the word pinche, right? Which means you stupid philosopher, get over here, right? So it was not something in the air for me, right? So that's why I had to tell that story as to how it happened that I ended up becoming this. Now, I suspect that sons and daughters of philosophy professors don't get that question. Like, why did you choose that? Because they fit the mold. They are destined. They are necessary, or at least that's how it seems. In their determination, they are somehow substantial, or at least no one has stopped them from thinking that. Right? I was thinking when I was writing this, I was thinking of the Strawsons, right? Like P.F. Strawson and his son Galen Strawson, and how predestined that might have felt, right? Now, I know that I am accidental, that I am a philosophy professor is an accident. More significantly, it is important that I know this, if for no other reason than knowing this keeps me vigilant. In my own life, I have adopted an attitude of accidentality. Vigilance is a practice of this attitude. I am vigilant not to conform to my role, not to take it for granted. If I feel twinges of entitlement, privilege, or elitism, I seek to catch and correct them quickly. Although my license plates do say El Relajo, which is a very pretentious way of saying that I wrote a book, right? And that's but I understand this, I recognize this, and I feel ashamed. Right? but I'm not gonna change it, right? It's like it is what it is. It is what it is now. But I do feel like, oh man, I got it. I feel kind of bad about it. To adapt an attitude of accidentality is to commit to care for my circumstance, for those that I love, for my health, for my work, since I know that everything stands on an unstable foundation that could crumble at any moment. To be vigilant is not to be fearful or paranoid about losing it all, though, rather with the knowledge that accidentality is a natural condition of things. To be vigilant is to care for and love what I have now. It is to believe that it is my fortune to be who I am. Thank you.